great honor to wish you all welcome. To those of you who come from afar, we wish you welcome to Athens. To everyone else who live here on a daily basis, welcome to the Italian school and to this conference. The conference is organized jointly by the 3 Scandinavian institutes here in Athens. So as the director of the Norwegian Institute at Athens, this evening's first thanks go to the co-organizing institutes by their respective directors, Jenny Valsted from the Swedish Institute and Kristina Jakobsen from the Danish Institute. A great collaboration also on this occasion, as like on so many other occasions. From the Norwegian Institute side, we recently changed our logo to a stylized ship that could be both a Viking ship and perhaps also an ancient Greek ship. A conference on the Nordic people in the Mediterranean area in ancient times would be a great topic for a conference on the occasion of our 30th anniversary, which we celebrate this year. We celebrate the anniversary in full knowledge that our 30 years and the slightly longer for the Swedish Institute represent but a tiny fraction of Nordic presence in the eastern Mediterranean basin. The full extent of this is perhaps only visible from Greece. The sources that mention those people from the north in various ways, Byzantine, Ottoman sources, texts written in Arabic, and so on. Upon mentioning this idea in one of our many conversations, we discovered that you Danish and Swedish colleagues have been harboring similar ideas for some time. So, since joining our forces would also create a larger and stronger conference, we also joined forces on this occasion. And so, this conference happened. The focus on our Viking past, and I believe this is shared among the Scandinavian countries, is on its function as a kind of foundation narrative for our national projects. This focus obviously leads to a limited perspective on this international seafaring culture. We use this past to construct our respective national pasts and forget often about the rest. Part of what this conference will do is to demonstrate that such a narrative reduces what the Viking culture represented and contributed. The extensive trade and cultural exchange, for example, technological advances based on knowledge exchange, and so on. What Viking culture represented outside of Scandinavia may in the end be much more interesting than the stories of the intrigues and feuds between the various kings in the north and those others with ruler ambitions. Another stereotype that is used for national projects is the Viking male warrior culture. And this stereotype is also challenged today. The idea was the Viking male who traveled around the world to steal, kill, and rape. Sometimes when confronted by these stereotypes, I have, for example, here or in other European countries, I have said jokingly that frustrated Viking men did this because they were locked out of their house by their wives who kept the key, so they had nowhere else to go. That is maybe kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek, but recent research, especially in Sweden, complicates this picture further, especially with the find of the female warrior graves, for example, in Birka. Thus, perhaps also the Viking presence in the Mediterranean throws some different light on the gender roles of Viking society. This is an interdisciplinary conference, so it will bring together knowledge from different disciplines that study the ancient Mediterranean: archaeology, history, languages, culture, etc. For someone who is external to this research area, as I am myself, it is more exciting to discover how the Vikings are described in sources that not so many Viking scholars have so far had access to, because they are in languages that are not normally studied. studied as part of Viking studies in the Nordic countries, for example, Arabic. I hope that this conference can contribute to widening the areas that are seen as relevant in Viking studies. On the Norwegian Institute side, it is Higher Executive Officer Zarko Tankosik, here at the back, who has been part of the organizing committee and done all the practical arrangements, and they are not few. So I want to take the occasion to thank you, Zarko, and you will hear more about all the practicalities tomorrow morning, when he will let you know everything you need to know. He is also the one you should go to if you have questions regarding the practical matters. Thanks also go to the scientific committee for the solicitation of papers for the conference. The expenses for the conference are mostly shouldered by the institutes themselves, but in addition we are very grateful to have sponsorship from the project The Viking Phenomenon at Uppsala University, and also from Helge Axon Jonsson's stiftelse. We finally want to thank the Italian school for hosting us here tonight, like with so many other occasions when we are expecting larger audiences. I will now leave the word to the Swedish director Jenny Wagensten, who will introduce this evening's opening keynote speaker, Professor Neil Price.
It is truly an honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Professor Neil Price. Professor Price is the chair of archaeology at the Department of Archaeology, Classical Archaeology and Egyptology at Uppsala University, as well as the holder of a distinguished professorship awarded by the Swedish Research Council in connection with the project The Viking Phenomenon. Professor Price began his career in archaeology with a BA in medieval archaeology at University College London in 1988, and afterwards continued postgraduate research at the University of York. He then joined the archaeologists working on the Swedish Viking settlement of Grikkland and stayed in Sweden, first working as an archaeologist and then pursuing doctoral studies at the University of Uppsala. After positions in Oslo, Stockholm, and a co-directorship of a Harvard School in Viking Studies, Neil Price went on to Aberdeen, where he literally built the Department of Archaeology from scratch as chair of this new unit. Needless to say, when Uppsala University were able to welcome him back in 2014, they were very, very happy. Professor Price also holds several honorary and adjunct professorships, and I can only single out a few. He is honorary research chair in archaeology at the University of Aberdeen. He holds an adjunct professorship of archaeology at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and an honorary senior research fellowship at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I also have to mention something that I found very intriguing, and I will ask Christina and Neil more about this afterwards. He is a member of the Laboratory for Past Disaster Studies at Aarhus University. Professor Price's vast publication list and research interests can be divided into two broad categories, one embracing the early medieval North, approximately 400 to 1100 Christian era, especially the Viking Age, and another focusing on the historical archaeology of the Asia-Pacific region from the 1700s to the present. Again, we are truly honored to be able to welcome him here tonight as our keynote speaker, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who is very impatient to listen to the lecture, entitled From Norvasund to Grikkland, the Vikings in the Middle Sea. Welcome.
Thank you, Jenny, for that very kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. And I'm sure I speak for all of you as well. Isn't it wonderful to be here in Athens? Make sure I've got the right glasses on here. I haven't got the right glasses. become a kind of accepted notion now that one of the great areas of new frontiers in Viking studies is the east, the far east, extending beyond the Russian river systems onto the Asian steppe, and also further to the south, further into the Caliphate and the Arab world. But if we look to Western Europe, until relatively recently, there were still some areas of blanks on the Viking map. Amongst others, places like Wales and Brittany. But I think it's quite interesting that what we're all here to talk about over the next few days is a place that, as far as I know, has never been the subject of a single academic conference or even a single academic work, the Vikings in the Mediterranean. And I think part of the reason for this, and now I'm talking particularly to my fellow speakers, when I first heard about the idea of this conference, I was very excited, and I love being in Athens, so I was thinking, this is wonderful. And that was immediately followed by the thought, what on earth am I going to talk about? And you recognise that feeling. It's not easy to find discrete topics to talk about within this field. There is an obvious focus in the Eastern Mediterranean and Byzantine. The Byzantine world and its connection with the Viking world is a very well-known part of the Viking diaspora. I'm not going to say very much about that tonight, not least because several of you are doing so over the next few days. But I do just want to point out that when we talk about the Vikings, whether with inverted commas or without, and Byzantium, there's a natural focus on the guis, on the Russian waterways, in the modern sense of that term, on the Byzantine campaigns, the role of Scandinavians as mercenaries in those activities, also on the Aegean, the Ionian, and the Adriatic, and very much access to all of that, in Scandinavian terms, from the north. There's very much less focus on the Mediterranean proper, on the cultures that border it, whether Arab, Frankish, African, or post-Roman in the widest sense, and on access from the west, and also its extensions, south and east. If we move to the west, there is another natural area of focus, which is Muslim Iberia. Even here, there's not a great deal of work, despite the fact that I don't think it's going too far to call it a Mediterranean superpower, is very much established on the Iberian Peninsula in the form of the Emirate of Cordoba. It took some time to source this illustration. There are actually reconstructions of Cordoba and the time of the Vikings, and there's one set of works by someone who I very much hoped was going to be here, and she was going to be, but had to pull out at the last moment, I'm afraid. I want to very much acknowledge the contribution of Anne Christis. Her book, Vikings in the South, is the first really major study of this area. If you don't know it, look it up. It's very much focused on the Arab sources, deals a little bit with the Christian ones, but Anne is truly an expert on the Emirate and the Caliphate of Cordoba, and this is really revolutionising the way that we're looking at this end of the Mediterranean. Which is not to forget the Christian kingdoms in the north of Iberia, especially around the region of Galicia. There are works on these too, some in Spanish and indeed Catalan, some in Danish, dealing mostly with Iberia as a whole, but also focusing on the north. What I want to do this evening is take a case study of one particular episode that spans most of these regions I've just mentioned. And it's a case study that I think is quite interesting, it's quite exciting, it's going to gain new prominence in Scandinavia, as it's now under discussion as the centrepiece of the new Viking galleries at the National Museum of Denmark, for example. But it brings with it every kind of problem you can think of connected with the Vikings in the Mediterranean, including a couple that have already been mentioned. And it's the great raid, there's a reason why this is in inverted commas, of Björn Jernsider, Björn Ironside, and Hasstein, between about, because we can't even agree on dates, 859 to 862. As far as we know, this is the first time that Scandinavians entered the Mediterranean from the west, through the Straits of Gibraltar. It's a 3-year expedition that began on the Loire in France. It at least got as far as Tuscany, and quite possibly rather far beyond that. Arguably, and we could really argue about this, it's the most ambitious Viking raid in history. And for all of those reasons, it forms a useful lens through which to look at the Mediterranean as a whole. We could start off with a nice blank map, that's always handy. It appears that this expedition began on the island of Norvasund, which was originally a monastery but had been taken over by Vikings during the middle of the 9th century, and set up as the main base for the Scandinavian fleet that was based on the Loire River. So they were using the Loire as a sort of watery motorway down into the heart of Francia, but more or less living full-time on this island. The first point of contention is exactly how large this raiding fleet was. There are many figures. The ones most often quoted are a nice exact 62 or a nice round 100. And there are other figures as well, so you can take a pick of those. Where did they go? It appears that the first time we encounter them is in 859, when they raid rather vaguely along the coasts of Aquitaine, clearly heading south. They raid Pamplona later that year and set up some kind of base, we don't really know what, at Iru. They're certainly in Santiago and La Coruña later that year. So you can see they're starting to round the Cape. They attack Lisbon with some success. And then make a very bold adventure up the river to Seville, where they encounter pretty serious resistance. It all starts to go rather wrong, so they go down the river again, quite quickly. They attack Cadiz, and this is the point at which they go through the Straits of Gibraltar, apparently unopposed. And they make raids on both shores of the sea. Algeciras, and then, spectacularly, I think, it's the first, as far as we know, some of the first Viking incursions into North Africa, the Kingdom of Nakur in Morocco. They carry along the southern Spanish coast, in modern day terms. They hit the Balearic Islands, one after another. And then they raid up along the Valencian coast towards the north. Then, coming out of Muslim territory, they go into the south of the Frankish Empire and start raiding around Narbonne, Perpignan. This is still 859, so in the course of this year, they've gone completely round Iberia. And then they overwinter at a base in the Camargue. This is the marshy area near the mouth of the Rhone. After that, they head north, Nîmes, Arles, and Valence in 860. This is where it gets really tricky. They next pop up in northern Italy, on the very border of Tuscany. They certainly attack Pisa in 860. There are also references to them attacking the very small town of Luni and also Bisoli. Now, what you've got on the screen there, it looks quite neat and tidy. The big problem with this is that it might not be true. So I may have been lying to you for the last 5 minutes, and this is where if we could bring in about 10 Viking specialists, we'd all have a punch up at the front here, because no one can quite agree on this. And the real bone of contention is the big story that has grown up around the attack on Luni. Because the idea behind this immense undertaking, because it really is quite an endeavour to take this number of ships all the way from the mouth of the Loire right the way to Tuscany, is that their objective, allegedly, was to sack the city of Rome. And you can imagine that's rather a big ambition for Vikings. The story goes is that they get to the outskirts of the city through various somewhat ridiculous stratagems. They manage to overcome resistance and they finally take Rome. At which point someone kindly informs them that it's not actually Rome, it's Luni. And then there's all kinds of hilarity ensues, and they don't like discovering that it's in fact Luni. And then they sort of disappear from the written record. And here's the first point of contention. This business about trying to attack Rome and failing spectacularly, this only appears in much later sources. Is that true or not? And you will find this repeated in many narratives, including some of mine actually, that this is the ultimate goal of the ultimate Viking raid. Is that true or not? And the other question is what happens afterwards? Because this enormous Viking fleet disappears from the historical record for just over a year before they re-emerge, coming out of the Mediterranean, again through the Straits of Gibraltar. What do they do for that year? It seems certain that they don't go west, because somebody would have written about it. There's no reason why they'd have appeared in all these sources up to that point and then suddenly vanish. I think we can be fairly sure that they continue south along the Italian coast. This would be in 861. I think we can also be fairly sure that they don't in fact sack Rome, because someone would have mentioned that as well. You can imagine the rather embarrassed going on their ships here, sneaking past Rome. It's possible that they go to Constantinople, or at least to Greece. There's sources from the mid-11th century, so this is, we're going well over 100 years later at this point, maybe 200 years. Then they sailed to Greece. Perhaps it's literally Greece, maybe it's the Byzantine Empire. Even more exciting, there are sources from the 10th century, Arab sources, that suggest that they carried on raiding along both coasts of the Mediterranean. They went to Rome land, which could mean Italy, but could also mean Byzantium, and thence to Alexandria. And there are several sources that mention them as far east as Alexandria. And that, I think, is as remarkable as an attempt on Rome. The idea of the Vikings is just simply not in our records. So I think this is really quite an interesting possibility. I think it's fairly likely that they overwinter between 60 and 61 somewhere in the east. Exactly where, we have no idea. The next point of certainty, wherever they went, is in 861, because that's definitely when they went back. Those are the raids I've shown you already. This is on the way in. Exactly which route they took is anyone's guess, really. There is a very late source that mentions them going back to the Command and raiding round the mouth of the Rhone. There are lots of sources that mention them making an attempt on the Straits of Gibraltar, at which point they found it blocked by an Arab fleet. There was a very large battle. Then the Vikings lose 2/3 of their ships, but a third make it through, including the ships of the commanders. They may raid southwards again into North Africa, though it's possible that this raid is on the way in. the sources are a bit ambiguous. They ravage the coasts, and you can interpret that how you will, as they head back north. They attack Pamplona again in 861, before finally making it back to their base at Mediter, 862, so 3 years after they set out, with a third of the ships they started with, around 20. How do we know any of this? I'm not sure how clear that is on the screen, but each of the colours represents a different nationality in a very, very crude sense of sources. So we've got Frankish sources, not surprisingly mainly referring to what they are in Francia, Asturian and Galician sources from the north of Iberia, Arab sources, even Irish, Norman and Icelandic. And there's also a broad chronology to those. So as you go down the list of sources on the top left there, you're broadly getting later in time. But what you have is a very clear indication that there is no one narrative that tells you all of that. You piece it together from snippets. And there are certainly some historians who actually don't want to accept that when it says that the Vikings are on the coast of Aquitaine, and then in a different source that Vikings hit Pamplona the same year, that it's the same Vikings, because the sources don't say that. They just record what happens there and then. My personal feeling is that you can actually join the dots because they make a very clear sequence, and unless Viking raids on the Mediterranean are like buses, you wait for years and then there's 5 at the same time. It is rather likely that these are the same people. But there's those problems that I mentioned. It is possible that this great raid is a conflation of 2 different attacks, because 3 years is a long time into which to fit a single set of actions. It's possible that there are more than one fleet operating in this region. That would certainly not be surprising if we were talking about Francia. There are at least 3 fleets operating simultaneously. It may well be that more than one went towards the Mediterranean. Once you start comparing all those sources from all those different dates and different regional traditions, you start to get the dates running together, being confused, where one source will mention an attack at one place at a particular time and someone else will date it the following year. It's very hard to say which one is accurate, if either of them are. There's a similar conflation of names, localities, even directions of movement. Sometimes the Vikings seem to be going back west when you think they'd be going to the east. I think we can be sure that after Pisa in 860, the course of the raid enters the realm of hearsay. We simply can't be sure. It quickly turns into legend, and it's a tale that very, very much grows in the telling. And I'll get to that in a few moments. Clearly, whoever it was that was doing this, and whatever it was they actually did, it left a very, very long-lasting legacy in the mind of the North. And I think in the minds of all these places that we went to as well. People were telling stories about this raid for hundreds and hundreds of years. It clearly left a mark. Perhaps the most fundamental question is kind of an obvious one, it's also quite interesting. Were they really aiming for Rome? I have to tell you, in my opinion, almost certainly not. There are several reasons for this. In one of the sources, the Frankish sources, it's actually an Arab fleet that is raiding in Luni, so that might be where that comes in. And the Frankish sources are normally quite reliable. It really is quite hard to believe that Scandinavians who'd seen Constantinople could mistake Luni for Rome. That in 62 ships worth of Vikings, not a single one could make that judgment, or maybe they didn't like to point it out. But it is hard to believe. when you get to the Norman stories, so we're talking into the 11th century now, a kind of retrospective history of the Normans of their Viking past. It's then that these sources that really start to embellish, to introduce the idea of them attacking Luni, mistaking it for Rome. The problem is that the way they do that is a kind of set piece that appears in other sources about quite different places at quite different times. It's kind of like a shaggy dog story that wanders the north about the crazy things that Vikings do when they want to attack a city, and this time it's in Luni. I think really it's very hard to see that as reliable history. This is also the part of the tale that really expands, especially into Icelandic sagas, on into the Middle Ages. They really liked this idea of the Vikings going to Rome. It's the beginning of the Viking legend about this. But this is Luni, quite hard to say from Rome. But if you ignore the exaggerations, if you ignore what I call the Roman mistake, the facts of Viking attacks on Ligurian and Tuscan towns in the 860s are not in serious doubt. There aren't enough sources that record this, whether it is actually Luni or not, or whether it's the area around it. The Vikings are definitely there. So it does put them on the map. Personally, I think that the sources that place them in Alexandria are also pretty reliable. We can discuss that, certainly, but it is not a crazy idea that they would go so far east. It's not an enormous distance, either by general terms of Scandinavian travel in the Viking Age, or in terms of where this particular fleet has already been. I think it's also important to introduce the human element in all of this. If you're spending this amount of time cruising the Mediterranean, you talk to people, especially people who'd rather you weren't there. Viking fleet, you don't want to stay here, that's useless, but if you go over there, Alexandria, it's amazing. Off you go. The idea of there being a place worth visiting, the delta of the Nile, the gateway to Egypt, this doesn't seem to me in the slightest a far-fetched idea that someone would mention to a Viking raiding fleet. And then there's those names that I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, but I haven't mentioned again so far. The commanders of this fleet. Björn Ironside. Did he really exist? Was he really nicknamed Ironside? And why? And when? Did he really lead this raid? We can ask the same questions about Hassan. Who was he? What were their life stories? Were they really, and this is where you really start getting into the legendary part, were they really the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, perhaps the most famous Viking ever? If you think of this in terms of Arthurian legend, Ragnar Lothbrok is King Arthur for the Vikings. He's a sort of magnet for legends and stories and exaggeration. At the core of this person, there may have been a real individual. Personally, I think there probably was, but again, that's a bone of contention. But over the centuries, he attracts more and more famous Vikings into his family until they're all related to Ragnar Lothbrok. And the commanders of this raid, according to the sources, Björn and Hassan, are two of his sons. I'm going to ask your indulgence for a moment, a bit of a list here, but just to sort of give you a flavour of where you can go with these kinds of problems. If you start with the contemporary sources, the Annals of St. Bertin, and this is one of the main Frankish chronicles, there is a man named Berna, which we think is Björn, named as one of the leading Viking commanders in Frankfurt, and a raid from his base leads to the Mediterranean. This is also, and I apologise especially to the Danes in the room now, as a Briton, every time I've met a Dane and I say, hello, my name's Neil, and they tell me their name, I can almost never quite understand what they say. And I think if you can imagine, I'm being serious now, if you can imagine an encounter on a Frankish river and someone says, Very frequently. They can end up with all kinds of names. It's not a strange translation of this. It really isn't. This filters through. And I should add the way it's going. It speaks of Norwegian. So this man Berno is the earliest possible historical origin for the person who becomes Björn Ironside in the sources. The contemporary Arab and other Frankish sources don't name the commanders of the raid. They just say it sets out in Loire. Hastein appears in the English sources as active in Western Europe just prior to the raid. It's not until the 11th century, so we're looking quite a bit after the time of the raid itself, that the two oldest sons of Ragnar, which is what Ragnar has become, are said to have led the raid. They don't name them, so you've got Irish sources coming in here. And then, also in the 11th century, two Norman sources, Dugo of St. Quentin and William of Jumièges, who start to bring in Hastein and then Björn Kostaferre, Björn Ironside. So it's not until well over 150, getting on for 200 years after the raid, that you start to get them really linked. And then into the 12th century and later, this is when Björn Ironside's legend really takes off. He gets more and more brothers, Ragnar's family expands, and then by the time you get into the Icelandic sagas properly, this fleet ends up going absolutely everywhere that Vikings went. It's the full Lonely Planet itinerary of Western Europe. It's not just the Mediterranean. They go to Switzerland, they go back up into Germany, they go down the Rhine, all over the place. And it sort of encompasses the whole of the Viking raiding world attached to these figures, until not only do you have a very comprehensive Icelandic heritage, which is almost entirely spurious for these individuals, but even now, fairly close to Stockholm, you can visit Björn Ironside's grave, which is a lie. But interesting that even outside Stockholm, you have his mythical resting place. Now at this point, I'm just going to take a slight excursion into an area that you probably didn't expect to hear about this evening, but I'm not being flippant. I think this is relevant. I want you to think for a moment of people like this. Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, or any of the other mythologized figures of the American West, the American frontier. And consider that process whereby they've become modern American myths. It's a process which started in their lifetimes, absolutely, and continues to our own time. We've got stills from films up there. If you go into an American bookstore, you will find purportedly academic histories of these individuals. Half of their contents is hearsay. It is just not real. There's an entirely mythical quality to these people. And it's interesting, I think, I don't want to make too much of this, but the time difference between their lifetimes and now is really not that much difference between the time of the Mediterranean raid and the sources that start to put in the detail. And I want to elaborate on this a little bit. You'll gather that I'm a fan of westerns at this point. If any of you are, you might be familiar with The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. It's a John Ford film, one of his later ones, 1962. John Wayne. The plot is basically a man who is wrongly given credit for shooting a notorious criminal, and he spends the rest of his life living off the reputation that this has given him. And the framing device for this film is that in old age he comes clean about what actually happened. It was someone else completely different who shot the bad guy. And his idea is that when he tells this to a journalist, he's going to set the record straight, the truth will finally come out, and he can go into retirement with a clear conscience. And when he's told his story, this is at the very end of the film, the journalist comes back with a line that has become one of the most famous ones in all of Western cinema. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And there is a kind of truth to that. And I'm just going to close with a different kind of Western. Unforgiven, directed by Clint Eastwood in the early 90s. This is very much a revisionist Western, critiquing the kind of Western I've just talked about. It's partly about Westerns. And one of the marvellous things about it is there's a gunfighter called English Bob who travels around with his own biographer, who mythologises his past, who reinvents him as the Duke of Death, and then benefits from the reputation that this confers. It really is starting the process in this person's lifetime. And although this is a movie, they actually did this. There are plenty of these sort of trashy novels that were produced about these kinds of people while they lived. And just to get us back to the Viking Age, I think that's rather like a schol. And I'm not being flippant. And of course, that process continues, because we do that as well, with figures like Bjorn Ironside. But, and this is part of the point, as with the American gunfighters and their kind, printing the legend doesn't mean that those people didn't exist. And it doesn't mean they didn't do some of the things that end up in the legend. And if you go from the contemporary sources, it seems clear to me, and that's why I've emphasised this in red, because this is contentious, it seems clear to me that Björn and Hastine were real individuals. They were certainly senior commanders of the Viking forces in Europe. There's no proof at all that they led that raid. But I think there's a good case to be made that they did. And I think particularly if they didn't, it requires really quite seriously asking the question, why did so many people think they did? Because that also has to come from somewhere. Why do the Normans pluck those particular individuals out of history and attach them to those stories? Why? And this is why I've chosen this raid as an image for this conference, as a metaphor for it, as a window onto that problem that I started with, namely, what on earth do we talk about? There's lots of these things that go through the event I've described that I think are applicable to all the different aspects of what we're here to discuss. The first is that this is a difficult palimpsest of multicultural textual sources, with a very broad range of chronologies produced in a very broad range of contexts. And we have to get on board with that and all its difficulties. And I don't think there's a single individual who can do that. We have to work together on that. Crucially, I think, this can only be understood against the wider background, both in archaeology and history, of what the Scandinavians are doing over that entire area. Not just from one end of the Mediterranean to another, but stretching much further north back into Europe, because these are the same people. This is a problem that is I think, still an issue even in sort of mainland Western Europe. We have books that talk about the Vikings in England, talk about the Vikings in Francia. They are quite literally the same Vikings. It's rather easy to cross the English Channel, and they did a lot. We have to see this as integrated narratives. We can't understand what any of these people are doing in the Mediterranean if we don't understand that in the context of what they do everywhere else. This is something I find quite interesting. These are narratives that span the transition, the very difficult to catch transition between sort of history and legend. Nowadays, as you all know, the Vikings are some of the most stereotyped individuals and ancient cultures in the world. The picture that most people have of them is not entirely the one that Viking specialists would always choose to convey, to put it mildly. That is a process that started in the Viking Age. I think this is something we really need to think about, that this process of Viking autobiography, starting with people like the schools, is something that is very much the beginning of where we are now with all those different narratives. So we're going from an ancient reality to ancient stories and then to later stories. And that's not an easy progression. It's something that very much flows into one another. You can go back and forth on that axis. And then, as an archaeologist, I think it's deeply depressing to have to acknowledge this, but I do think we have to acknowledge it. There is a very minimal material record of this. It is very, very hard to pick up in material culture. I was very pleased to hear this raised in the introduction earlier. I've chosen to talk about this raid because of these reasons, that I think it acts as an entry point to a lot of the things that we're going to talk about. At the same time, what I've been talking about is, let's face it, kings and battles history, isn't it? It's big events, it's raids, it's expeditions, it's commanders, things like that. There are so many other questions that are not being asked that often, that we need to focus on with events like this. And you'll see the connection with what was said earlier. I was very pleased to hear this. One of those is gender. The formal record of this event is an entirely androcentric one, with one small exception. And I'm very pleased that there are papers at the conference addressing these issues, because we have to talk about them. Whether it was Björn and Hastein who did this, the expedition of 859 to 62 is not the only Scandinavian contact with the Western Mediterranean. This is just raids. You can see the key up there. 9th century in yellow, Björn and Hastein, or whatever, in red. 10th century raids in black, and 11th century ones in green. It's not an exhaustive list. Someone else would make a different map. Please don't sort of suddenly point to one and say, what's that? Because I won't be able to tell you. You can go to lots of different syntheses and primary sources and make different maps. Even doing something like this is a process of considerable interpretation. But there is actually quite a lot there, especially when you get up into the northern part of Iberia. The Scandinavians are operating there for years at a time. It really is very similar to what they're doing in Francia. And then, of course, these are interacting with all those cultures and polities around the whole of the Mediterranean. The Emirate of Cordoba becomes the Caliphate of Cordoba in the early 10th century. Another political player, another development. And the same kind of thing is going on at the other end of the Middle Sea. So, just to conclude, here we are in Athens. I'd just like to add my own small measure of welcome in the very limited amount of sponsorship that my project was able to provide for this. Really welcome to this conference. Yeah, I think it's so exciting that this is the first ever gathering of Viking scholars to talk about the Mediterranean itself. All the way from Norvasund, which is the Straits of Gibraltar, to Greece, and I think probably substantially beyond that, to the shore of the Levant, and what I really do think is the last academically unexplored landscape of the Viking diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. That was a really brilliant lecture and a wonderful start for the conference. I can also say it was a great comfort for me because I recently presented the work of the Institute, the Swedish Institute in Stockholm, And I mentioned that we were going to have this Viking conference, and one participant in this meeting immediately protested and said, "But don't you know that the Vikings never ever went to the Mediterranean?" That is just an invention by the Swedish writer Frans G. Bengtsson. So now I feel quite relieved that the conference will not be in vain, and also of the literary kind. I have one practical message, and that is that tomorrow, for those of you who are joining the sessions tomorrow, please remember that they will not be here at the Italian school. They will be at the Danish Institute, which is in Flacka, here on those 14. But it's not far. Should you pick the wrong venue? I did that myself Friday, and if you run, it's exactly 7 minutes. I now also have a suggestion. I propose that we all make a relatively short expedition to the Swedish Institute, and let's raid the reception that I know is prepared. But once again, thank you so much, Neil, for a wonderful